Hey, hi
Hello,
Joni.
this is Brian Daitzman, History of the Present. I'm the host, and we're starting to do some. Okay, hello, this is Brian Daitzman. This is the host of History of the Present. History of the Present, we do record with Lincoln Square, who's our co producers once a week. But, the Intellectualist is also looking to do some interviews during the week, daily interviews, and sort of bring in different mix of people so that we can talk about the issues that are really driving today. Here today we're here with Joni Ascola, who let me just please tell me if I have this right. You are studying for a PhD in international security. Is that accurate?
Almost accurate. So my PhD is in public policy actually, but I on top of writing about public policy and doing research in public policy, I also work on issues related to geopolitics and so on. And I studied geopolitics during my master's degree.
What right today, Joni? What are one or two things that are maybe occupying your attention more today than maybe more than you wish it was?
I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. I'm obviously worried about the U.S. and the direction it's taking because as a European, we have been trusting the US as an ally and we have been expecting the US to help us. And obviously, we have also helped the US in our way. And we have shared a lot of common values. And obviously, right now, it doesn't seem like our governments are sharing many values with your current administration and the way the country is going. So that's one worry. And then, obviously, another big worry for us in Europe is Russia because Russia is invading a European country in Ukraine, committing genocide there. But at the same time, Russia is uh, quite isolated and quite dangerous, and it doesn't want to give up even if it cannot reach its
It doesn't want to give up, even if
quote
it cannot reach its
injured
goals.
bear. It's quite dangerous. So we have these two things at the same time, and it makes things even worse because normally we have the U.S. Helping deter Russia, but this time we don't really have the U.S. helping us. So you have all of this, and then you combine that with the far right doing quite well in polls and probably doing well in the future key elections that Europe has in France and Germany. So lots of worries at this, and at the same time, obviously there are other long-term issues such as climate change and so on that we see in Europe with lots of forest fires and so on. And obviously with the wars, it's not like we're working hard to stop that. So many crises at the same time, and no clear strategy to face any of them. And that's probably what worries me the most.
Why does it seem like Europe so you Americans they maybe I think they hear European Union and they think United States, right? Can you explain why the Union, well, obviously there's a lot of benefits to it economically, how the military, foreign policy, national security, how it's not like us in the United States.
Yeah, we're unfortunately, I mean, fortunately, unfortunately, it depends who you ask, but yeah, we are not one single country. We're just sort of an alliance, and so in that sense, we don't share fiscal policy, we don't have the same tax policy, we don't have the same foreign policy, and we don't have the same defense policy. We have some European rules and regulations that we all follow that we decide to agree on, but on most things, unfortunately, we don't. And as we have very different interests as well, even on security, for example, Portugal doesn't feel very threatened by Russia because Russia is so far away. While for us in Finland, we share a lot of border with Russia, so for us it's a big issue. So it's quite complicated, and unfortunately, on many key issues, we need every single member state to agree for things to go forward. So things go forward quite slowly, and our enemies use this against us because they know that you only need one country to block anything. So anytime we try to move forward and integrate more and move maybe towards more something that would look like the United States, maybe towards more federalism, maybe towards a common European army and a common European foreign policy, You have Russia and China, and unfortunately nowadays the US as well, trying to stop it from happening by using their proxies in Europe. It used to be Viktor Orban in Hungary, but there are other ones now that he's gone. So that's why we're not that integrated yet.
And let me ask you. Typically, Europeans don't, in terms of the politics in the United States. Obviously, people on the right or left or somewhere in between in Europe may have a preference, right? But in general, you didn't have the swings, right? And it was kind of probably until maybe 10 years ago or so, there really was not, we're talking about from 1945 to 2017, so about 72 years. I think there was probably a consensus that the United States was a security partner. There were members of NATO who died with Americans in the wars after 9/11, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm sure in other theaters related to the conflicts there. How is Europe, or maybe just in your particular instance, how are you dealing with the ping pong back and forth of U.S. foreign policy? So you had Trump one, then you have Biden, who's more of a traditional sort of Atlanticist, right? And then you have now Bush, sorry, not Bush. You have Trump too, who's actually far more extreme than he was, and even the first Trump term. Maybe you can speak to that. I think we may have lost. I think we may have lost Joni there. But really what we were just discussing is the fact that the Europeans, members of the European Union, have gotten used to um, a a much more uh, reliable United States from the period after World War II to the period right before President Trump was inaugurated for his first term. And after that, we have had sort of this back and forth. Oh, Joni, you're back. You're back with
Sorry,
us.
sorry, had some
It's
internet
okay.
connection problem.
It's okay. So just speaking about that, how are Europeans in general dealing with this sort of foreign policy that seems to go between extremes?
So for us with the US, we're not so used to dealing with this issue because until Trump won, uh, obviously there were differences between Democrats and Republicans, but whether it was Mitt Romney or McCain or Obama or whatever, all the options that were on the table were quite the same when it comes to Europe. Obviously, internally on US issues, there were massive differences between, let's say, George W. Bush and Obama, for example. But when it comes to NATO, to us as partners and so on, the difference was quite small, and because of that, we had no issue working with both sides, even if most Europeans would vote Democrat, even back then, if there would be an option, because Europeans are further to the left in general compared to Americans. But for example, back in the days, our center right parties in Europe used to support Republicans during elections. So I remember when Mitt Romney was running, many of our parties on the right were supporting him over Obama. And nowadays, these parties would not be able to support Trump openly, because if they did, it would really be bad for them, because Trump is really unpopular here in Europe. So that's really a big change. And I think when it comes to Trump, a lot of us expected things to be just like a one-term change and to somehow outlast him and wait it out and get back to Biden. And Biden was back to normal, back to what we're used to, and we're happy with that. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better for us. But then we were quite shocked when Trump was elected again, and that, I think, was a big wake-up call for Europeans. And unfortunately, it's going to be quite a long process after this to get the trust level and the collaboration back to the level where it was before, because a lot of Europeans already were a bit scared about the US when Trump was elected the first time, but I think the second time really made it clear to many of us that we cannot rely on the US as much as we used to, and we will need to define a new relationship. And obviously, we're not going to become enemies. I think that even if MAGA people keep getting elected or something, I don't think that Europe and the US are going to become enemies, but we're going to become partners instead of allies, I think, unfortunately. So it's going to move into that type of direction. There's going to be some work together and some collaboration, but for.
What are your concerns, if you have concerns, related to Greenland, and reports that a firm associated with President Trump or associated with the Trump administration is operating in Greenland against the wishes of the government? That's very concerning. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, my understanding based on the reporting was that Denmark, or the Europe in general, the European Union countries were prepared to shed blood over Greenland. Can you speak to that?
So I've read two different things about the company, the American company there. I've read somewhere that they're there against the will of the people of Greenland, but I've also read somewhere that they had a permission to actually put some of their equipment there already, but they just lack the final permission to actually start drilling. So I don't know which one is true or not, but it doesn't change my analysis on this thing. Obviously, Europeans got quite scared when Trump started talking about Greenland a couple months ago and last year when he really pushed to take Greenland, and when he met with the foreign minister of Denmark, or actually it was JD Vance that met with him, and when they seriously talked about taking Greenland, that was something that was scary to Europe. It was something that was against all our interests, obviously, because our troops should be stationed somewhere on the Russian border in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and not be stationed in Greenland, defending Greenland against the US. I think that Trump has tried changed his method or his strategy on Greenland in the sense that he doesn't aim to take it by force as a one-day operation anymore or anything like that. I think what he's trying to do is to incrementally take more and more by stationing more troops and then maybe having more economic links and so on. And this is probably part of that. And I don't know. It's just really hard to see these events as reality because, again, as a kid, I was always told that the U.S. is an ally. And when I was 16, I moved to Detroit for a year
Oh,
to go
wow.
on exchange in the U.S. and I loved Michigan and I really liked my time there. And the U.S. just has so many amazing places, and I've always considered the U.S. an ally. So obviously it doesn't feel great to be threatened. And I have lived in Denmark, and Danish people are even more pro-American than anyone else in the U.S. At least before Trump. Denmark was really one of those countries that you talked about that shed blood for the U.S. and for NATO by sending a lot of troops and having high casualties per capita in Afghanistan and so on. And they have always followed the U.S. anywhere the U.S. has asked them to. And Danish people have been just very pro-West and pro-U.S. in general. So them getting stabbed in the back is really worrying because for Finland, for example, for my country, which is a new NATO member, it doesn't make us think that it's worth getting too close to the U.S. when we see that. So it's a bad thing, and it's bad for the U.S. as well because the U.S. might have the biggest GDP per nominal GDP in the world, but at the end of the day, what makes the U.S. stronger than China is the fact that it has also quite strong allies that also have big economies and strong militaries. The U.S. plus the rest of NATO makes a formidable force. But if you take the U.S. alone and you make them face China, Russia, and so on, then it becomes more complicated. So if the West wants to beat our enemies, we need to be united, and Trump is doing everything he can to sabotage that unity. So that's something that's really worrying, and Greenland is the kind of like the tip of the iceberg on that, but it's something that's really worrying.
So let me show you, Joni, and let me show you with the gas is,
Mm,
recently I wrote a piece, and I'll make it a little bigger. Is that
yeah.
essentially, the got kind of piggybacking off this is that
Mm,
America appears to be squeezing Europe from the West with Greenland, and Russia, seeing weakness, is squeezing Europe from the East. And now we understand there's reporting suggesting that China is undermining Europe's industrial capacity, intentionally destroying it, basically undermining their ability to fight a war if they had to do it themselves. Um, how do you interpret that? I mean, it sure looks like that. It sure looks like they're being enveloped. And then in the actual countries themselves, they're
mm.
making it hard for them to finance their own defense. Is that a fair reading?
I think it's a fair reading. I'm not convinced that there's a sort of understanding between the US, China, and Russia on this. I think that it's kind of like the natural, sadly natural way of how things go when you have a continent that is being fought for by different groups. I think what Trump has done is that he's really empowered the concept of multipolarity and this concept of spheres of influence and
Which is
countries
totally
fighting for their
against
hemisphere.
our interests. We're trying against America's
Exactly,
interests. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely
There's
against American interests.
100%. I mean, if you look at how things were even under Biden, Europe was kind of like, if you look at it through the concept of spheres of interest, Europe was in the American sphere of interest in a sense because we were allies of the US and we would depend on the US on security and so on. And by keeping the status quo, uh, the US would have kept Europe as an ally. But now, by opening this competition for spheres of influence, what happens is that the US is losing some parts of Europe, at least potentially more, but at least some parts of Europe, while also losing other places. So it's kind of yeah, as you said, it's against the American interest to do that. But I don't know if Trump is doing it on purpose or if he's just I don't know. But it makes no sense from an American perspective to do that and to lose Europe.
And let's just be a little specific here. What does that mean? So from the beginning of this second term, the president of the United States has gone out of his way to antagonize Canada, right? United States and Canada share a major border across
Yep.
northern United States. The president has gone out of his way to antagonize Mexico, Central America, nations in South America becoming directly involved in ways that are probably more similar with the early 20th century in terms of the very ugly, openly influencing election. Now, uh, I believe Argentina recently had an election, and the president of the United States basically said that if people tied to Milei are not elected, basically he's going to cut funding for Argentina, right? And you see that, and then you see what's happening in Venezuela, all right? And basically, then you have members of the Trump administration bragging about extracting the natural resources and wealth of Venezuela for America's benefit. And obviously, you see what's happening in Europe, and yet at the same time, while he's attacking Europe, attacking UK, Canada, all traditional friends and allies. He is also kissing up to Vladimir Putin, which doesn't make any sense logically,
Yeah.
right? How does that look to Europeans?
It looks like treason to us, and it's actually you can even add the example of Asia to that as well, because you have those allies and those countries that the US is used to dealing with, but then you have Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines, and many of them really rely on the US against China and North Korea and Russia as well to be able to stay safe. And the message has been pretty similar to them as well, and they also haven't gotten any extra support during Trump time. So before Trump was elected, there was this promise of pivot to Asia. So at least there was this idea that maybe even if he gives up on traditional allies, he will still at least focus on China and try to counter China in Southeast Asia. But he's not even doing that. He's also giving up on those allies. So it's kind of like a lose-lose isolationist strategy. And then at the same time, while he's doing all of that, he's doing the one thing that he was not supposed to do, which is to go into wars in the Middle East and to put all the resources there. Well, that was something that's completely against the idea of pivot to Asia. So the whole foreign policy and attitude towards allies is something that doesn't make much sense. It doesn't follow any clear ideology, because if he were a true isolationist, he would just not be focused in the Middle East, and he's not doing that. And if a true isolationist would not be involved in Argentina and in Venezuela and in Cuba, and would not be threatening Greenland and Canada. So it's not isolationism, but it's also not a hawkish, classic neocon policy of trying to be everywhere and trying to do so. It's kind of like the worst of both worlds. You have the worst sides of
Right.
isolationism, and then you have the worst sides of neocon policy, and that's unfortunately Trump's foreign policy.
Yeah, it's like, let's start as many fires as possible globally. Venezuela, Iran, um, let's undermine our strategic uh, alliances. For what reason? I don't know. I mean, I can't make any sense of that. Why are we antagonizing the Canadians? Right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And I'd say most Americans, regardless of party or ideology, would say, why are we doing this? Right? I also think that um, his solicitousness, the way he is so I'll use the word submissive and deferential, which are not good traits in a president of any country, but particularly because the United States is so submissive and deferential to dictators. He goes to Putin, he praises him. This is someone who is currently under indictment by the International Criminal Court, I believe, uh,
Yeah,
for kidnapping Ukrainian children. And those same children now, based on reporting I saw yesterday, are now being put into the field by Russia to
yeah,
kill the Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Talk about sick. That's sick, right?
yeah,
Yet the president praises him as if he's this great man. And that, I'm sorry, that is something, doesn't matter what side you're on. Republicans, they do this, unfortunately, they do this uh bad boyer, good czar, right thing. So what that means is that and obviously you know this, Joni, but uh, in Russian history, people would not criticize the emperor, the king, the czar. When things are wrong, they blame the advisors. It's the advisors' fault. If only he was getting better advice, right? And maybe there's some truth to that here, because he doesn't have good advisors, right? A lot of his advisors are personalist to him, right? Um, but aside from that, these are his policies. So, right, he is at the end. It always stops with him, right? Regardless of what he would like to say, what other people say. Um, Let me ask you this: when he recently, and particularly for someone who studies international security, when he broke American precedent and he discussed Taiwan as sort of negotiable, right? He said basically Taiwan's negotiable. I forget the exact phrase, but essentially he made it clear that their security was negotiable for American interest. Um, at the same time, we are learning about all the depletion of these missiles. how do you square all of this? It's like, is he just like, how do you again, third party, you're not American, you're not Chinese. How do you look at that?
It was quite hard to watch because what you're referring to is when he was tying military sales to Taiwan to his dealings with China, and that's something that no U.S. president had ever done before, and he's still blocking some sales of systems Taiwan needs to defend itself, and he's trying to get some concessions from Xi Jinping in exchange of not selling these weapons to Taiwan. And obviously, I'm not Taiwanese, but if I would look at this from a Taiwanese perspective, it's quite a scary situation because we
Yeah.
have this American president who has been weak on all these dictators, as you said, Putin, Xi Jinping, and so on, and who also clearly is ready to negotiate your security with your enemy, which is much stronger, has way more resources than you. And then at the same time, this country that you don't know if you can rely on doesn't have any munitions left anymore to defend you, even if they wanted to, because they wasted them in a war where they actually lost and did not manage to reach their objectives. It puts Taiwan in a very, very tough spot, and and it makes me worried because in security and in defense, you have to think about the worst case scenario. And for the Western world, the worst case scenario would involve China and Russia making a move at the same time. Because if you would have China making a move on Taiwan and you would have the West maybe starting to send some vessels towards the Pacific, which
Yeah.
will take time, and some material there, that opens up opportunities for Russia to make a move in the Baltics. And unfortunately, the Baltics, which I love, my brother lives in Estonia, and those are great nations there, but it's an area that's really, really difficult to defend from the outside because there's Kaliningrad, south is part of Russia. So Russia has air defense systems there and vessels and so on. So there's only this Suwalki gap, which is a small gap between Poland and Lithuania, but that gap would be under heavy fire from Russian artillery and so on if trying to move equipment through there. So that would be quite difficult. So the only way for Europe to properly defend the three Baltic countries would be with the help of the US, because the US is capable of moving heavy transport planes and vessels through the sea, even at war, without necessarily getting drowned and downed. And without the US, Europe doesn't have that capability. So even if we have troops, we don't have any capability to move troops and equipment to the Baltics. And Russia knows that. So if the US would be focused on Taiwan, or even not helping Taiwan, but just not capable of helping Taiwan, then if Russia makes a move, it would be kind of like a checkmate for the West, because we could potentially lose the Baltic states to Russia and Taiwan to China at the same time. And obviously, the lack of munitions in the US is not only Trump's fault, it's something that has been building up over several presidents because there was just not enough investment in buying munitions. And Russia and China, unfortunately, understood quite early on that it's necessary to have really, really large stocks of ammunition. And the US and many in Europe didn't understand that, so we didn't focus on that. But knowing how little ammo there was and knowing how little production there was, Trump should not have gotten involved in a war in Iran, or if involved in that, he should have done it in like a 3-day operation or something. But he shouldn't have done what he did, which was to go all in the sense that he forced Iran against a wall and made them fight until the end, but without actually himself going all in. So he didn't put troops on the ground, which obviously is good. I didn't want troops on the ground, but he didn't use the resources to win, but he still put the enemy in a situation where it has to fight for its life, and made sure that he would lose and use all the ammo at the same time. So for Taiwan and for Asia, this is a horrible situation, and that horrible situation unfortunately mirrors as well to other sides, other continents in the world, including Europe.
I you know, I it it sure looks like, it sure looks like, I mean, you just went through that scenario where essentially, like you said, Russia attacks Europe from the east, China goes to Taiwan, right? And if those were to happen at the same time, that would be a frightening disaster. At the same time, too, as this is happening, you have democratic erosion in the United States, that is fairly significant. If we could speak to that, Joni, how did January 6th and January 6th in the United States context is, on January 6th, President Donald Trump he went to the ellipse in D.C. He gave this speech. He called for people to fight like hell, and they then marched to the U.S. Capitol. And 145 police officers were injured, and there were 7 deaths linked to that day. The president escaped all accountability there, and now he's discussing doing an emergency for midterm elections. What are your genuine concerns about U.S. democratic erosion, seeing how quickly it has happened?
So when January 6th happened, most of us in Europe kind of obviously we heard about it in the news, but we kind of underestimated the whole thing because obviously we looked at it and we thought that it's kind of like a clown show, and we're thinking, how is that even possible? But then, as it didn't really succeed, we didn't maybe realize how big it was on the day when it happened. But later on, obviously, when looking back at it, it was a coup attempt by the president of the U.S. And when we realized that, we thought that there would be no way that Trump would ever come back, because there's just in Europe, at
It
least
just
we think
seems
that
impossible.
Europe exactly. You cannot, and I mean, even South Korea obviously is different from Europe, but in South Korea the president tried a coup and it did not end well for him, and it's not something that we would even think that someone who tries a coup and fails would come back, and somehow Trump managed. And we even like, I don't know, maybe a year before the election, we still thought that even if he becomes the candidate and so on, he's just not going to be elected, because there's no way that he lost against Biden. And then he tried a coup and failed, and then he will go and win the next election. And somehow he still managed to win, and that was really scary for us. And when we followed what has happened during the last 18 months, and everything he's done with ICE and with all the his friends buying all the media and social media, and post-truth society that has installed itself more and more in the U.S. with facts meaning little, and uh, him still denying losing the election in 2020, and his people still denying that he lost that election, and so on. It's obviously extremely worrying. And when the war in Iran was on a hotter phase than it is now, I was thinking that he could maybe use that as an excuse for the midterms. Now it looks like that's not maybe going to be his excuse, so I don't know what he's going to do. But I think there is also, obviously, I'm not a U.S. politics specialist, but there is also a possibility for him to accept a loss during the midterms and to use that against Democrats in 2028, even if it's not him running. But I think that's also a possibility, because then if you have Democrats who have the House, for example, it's easier to blame them for the last 2 years if things don't go his way. So I'm not as convinced as I used to about him cheating in the midterms, or just not having elections or so on. I think he might actually accept a defeat in the midterms, maybe. But even if he loses the midterms, I think a lot of people will get a message of him being democratic and him accepting elections and so on. And I think that would be the wrong conclusion. I think that if he accepts the defeat in the midterms, it's purely because he knows he can't get away with not doing it. But it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that 2028 will be any better. And I'm quite scared for 2028, because I don't think that Democrats are united enough. And I don't think that people are aware of how much controlled opposition there is, and how much people like Musk and Trump and so on play on trying to divide Democrats and on trying to divide the opposition to Trump. And they're extremely good at that game. And that's a game you talked about how there are similarities between Putin and Trump on blaming the advisors and never blaming the actual leader. And one thing that Trump has learned from Putin is what Surkov taught to Putin is that everything needs to be a play. The whole presidency needs to be like a reality TV thing. And Russia did it in its own way with Putin, but Trump has been doing the same. And there is a show for everything. Every humiliation needs to be filmed. Every victory needs to be filmed. And there is that, but there's also the controlling of the opposition. And Trump has people in the Democratic Party and people who are opposed to him as well, who are working on his behalf. And we saw that with Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. and so on, and probably Jill Stein as well. Some people who have been used to weaken the Democrats during presidential elections. He will do the same in 2028, even if it's not for him, maybe even if it's for Vance or someone else. But Republicans have gotten quite good at playing that game of trying to divide and polarize the enemies. And for them, the enemies are the Democrats. So they will do everything they can to make Democrats not unite. And unfortunately, they are already quite successful at it. And I see it every day when watching debates online between DSA people and the rest of Democrats and so on. So I'm a bit worried about that. And as in Russia, Russia still has elections and will have elections in
Yeah.
September. These elections are jokes, they are real elections, but they still have elections because it's part of this game that you need to have these elections. And I think that Trump will try to go towards something like that. And Republicans after him will continue because it's in their interest. So yeah, everyone in Europe is quite worried about the state of democracy in the US.
I mean, where do you? I mean, this could potentially go really badly. Uh, this has potential to go really badly. I think in the next couple of years. Um, also, let me also say. So there has been recent reporting that U.S. intelligence indicates that Russia may attack Europe in the next few weeks. Right? It could be in the next couple of years, but they specifically said the next few weeks. And now there was was it a drone bombing or there was almost a drone bombing in Leipzig, Germany. There was an attack in Bulgaria, I believe, but there have also been other attacks. There's been and Europe continues calling this hybrid warfare. But if you're blowing things up and killing people, is it still hybrid warfare? So I'm curious. Why don't you speak to that?
I obviously would hope that Europe would answer in a harsher way when Russia does these things, and Russia has been doing a lot. If you look at a map of all so-called hybrid operations that have happened in Europe during the war in Ukraine, there have been many, 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 including many that have not been discussed or barely been discussed in the news. In my country, several water infrastructure buildings have been broken into, for example, and drones have been flying over energy infrastructure, and as you said, there was this drone with an explosive in Germany near Ukrainian planes. There have been a lot of these cases. I think the issue with not calling it hybrid is that Russia is likely wanting to create a sort of escalation. They're trying to use these escalations and these hybrid events to force an answer from us to then be able to escalate and use that as a excuse. So trap. And I think that's one reason why Europeans have tried to keep it small and not really entering that escalation competition with Russia. But the issue with the strategy is that Russia will keep going further and further until we respond. So we will likely continue this strategy as long as we can, and then at some point when Russia will go too far and Europeans will die and things like this, then obviously we'll answer a bit more, a bit harder. But it's really a tough one because once you start calling it acts of actual war,
You
you
have to
need to
respond.
answer, and if you don't answer, you're weak. So
Yeah.
it's not an easy thing to, and Russia is good at playing these games, unfortunately.
Um, let me ask you a couple more questions, Joni. This has been a great
Yeah.
conversation. In your opinion, right now, Vladimir Putin acts like he's going to live forever, right? He has essentially murdered or imprisoned any or harassed anyone who could replace him, anyone who could have maybe had the potential, let's say over 20 years, developed the experience to replace him, never got that experience, right? So Russia right now is held together by a man in his 70s who may or may not be in the best of health, but is acting like he's going to live forever. What happens? But we know that's not the case. Scientifically, everyone dies, right? So what happens when Vladimir Putin, he's at his dacha, and let's just say, he doesn't. He had a bad day. He passes away. What happens? It's not a constitutional republic. What happened? Who leads?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of talk at the same time about, as you said, Putin acting as if he would never die, and not saying who will be his successor, and things like that. But he's at the same time also allowed some rumors about succession to spread, because he wants people to know that he also has thought about the question. And there are a few names that are more discussed than others. I think it depends on if it's a surprise death or if it's something that gives him time to actually prepare the succession. If he just suddenly has a heart attack, it's quite likely that the succession, at least in the short run, would be someone who is not meant to stay in power for very long, but who's meant to just do the
Be a
time in between.
placeholder.
That could be the prime minister.
Yeah.
Exactly. That could be the prime minister, or some of the people in his close circle. He has a couple of these people who are in their 60s and 70s and who have a lot of experience, but who are loyal to him. And these people could be the ones that take the power for a couple months at least. But then you have people like his old bodyguard called Yumin, who is known to be someone that he has groomed to kind of become his successor. So he was his bodyguard for a long time, but then he became a governor of a republic in Russia, or a region, and then since then he has been appointed in the presidential administration. And he was, for example, responsible for the joint operations in Kursk when Ukraine was attacking towards Russian territory in Kursk. This guy was put in that position, and he's an engineer and a general, and he's, I believe, maybe 50 years old or so, so quite a lot younger than Putin himself. And he's someone who is known to be totally trusted by Putin and who could be one of his potential successors. And then you have Nikolai Patrushev, who is the maybe second most powerful man in Russia, and his son, whose name is also Patrushev, Dmitry Patrushev, I believe, is
Yeah.
also a minister in the government of Russia right now. He's known to be a second name. At least Patrushev would want his son to be the successor. Putin, we don't know what he thinks about it, but those are two of the younger guys who are potential names to become long-term successors. But I think that before having them, if it's a surprising death, there would be the current prime minister Mishustin, or maybe someone else for a couple of months. But it's it's a complicated situation that Putin doesn't want to think about, because he knows that even his power is quite weak and quite fragile, as we saw with the coup attempt by Prigozhin in 2023. And even if he has the local National Guard to attack people if they go on the streets, and he has a lot of people watching out, he has several intel agencies that are competing with each other so that one cannot overtake him, and so on. And he has built the system so that he cannot be taken down. But he knows that once he dies, these checks and balances, or security systems that he has built won't last for his successor, because the control he has is not something that he can just give to someone else. So Russia will become much more unstable, at least at some point after his death. And that will open a lot of possibilities as well. And that's why I think that the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. But one of the few things that could change that, and that could make the war end faster, Putin's death, because even if his successor would not be someone nice and not someone friendly towards the
Right, right.
West, the successor would be in a tough situation, and that tough situation could maybe open up possibilities for compromises and negotiations with that person who would maybe want, for example, sanctions to be removed to be able to start from a better position. But overall, I think Putin, as you said, we don't know about his health, but we also know that he's surrounded by the best doctors that Russia can get, and
Right,
he's being
right.
monitored a lot. So I think that if his health becomes worse, they will probably know about it and they will start preparing for it. And I think even for enemies of Russia, like its neighbors in the West, like us in Finland, we don't want too much instability in Russia because Russia is a country with nukes and a lot of other threatening things. So it's even if we hate Putin and we don't want Putin to do well, we still want Russia to stay somewhat stable, so that we don't suddenly pay the consequences with some war or something else. So we have to keep observing and seeing things. But you're right that he's not going to last forever, um, and the guy that's coming after him is likely not going to be an angel neither.
Well, if anyone has any questions and maybe wants to ask, you're more than welcome. If you don't, that's okay too. But we can get some questions in here. Let me ask you this, Joni. Um, the Russian Federation is built from the remains of the Soviet Union, which was built
Yeah,
on the base of the Russian Empire, right?
yeah,
So the Russian Federation to this day is still essentially a lot of the Russian Empire held together by violence.
yeah.
And not this is not like they voted and joined Russia, right?
No,
Um, do you foresee Russia and all of its provinces, right? You have St. Petersburg, Moscow, and then you have a lot of others. Then you have pretty much the rest of the country. Do you
yeah.
foresee Russia getting smaller in the next century?
Entry, it's possible. I don't want to bet on it because I don't know. The issue with these republics is that they're very dependent on money coming from Moscow, especially the poorer ones. So for many of them, even if you would sound like a good idea to become independent, it's not necessarily going to be that easy. But then you have places like Chechnya, for example, which fought against Russia in the 90s
Yeah.
and had two wars against Russia, and is only part of Russia because they bribed Kadyrov and gave him enough money and power to keep it Russian by force. But you have people from Chechnya fighting on Ukraine's side against Russia and so on. So a place like Chechnya, for example, could try to become independent. And um, obviously, if looking at the places that are occupied by Russia, whether it's in Georgia or Ukraine and so on, those might also, in the next 100 years, at some point, become harder to keep for um, mm, because there will be pressure from Georgia, but also from Ukraine at some point. But overall, for Russia, I don't know uh, how much potential there is for these republics to become independent. What Russia has done successfully, unfortunately, during Stalin's time, is they have mixed populations
Yeah.
by sending ethnic Russians to the republics of the USSR, but also internally. So the all the republics and all the places have been colonized, and it's not that there are not that many left that have a strong majority that comes from the local ethnic background. They have become minorities in many of them, and they all speak Russian and have been forced to stop speaking their local languages and so on. So it's not an easy process. But as you said, what's interesting about Russia is that it's an empire, and the USSR was one form of the Russian Empire that colonized also a lot of republics and also parts of Eastern Europe that were not part of the USSR. But even now that Russia is already much smaller than the USSR, it's still an empire with lots of colonies. And if looking at scholars who discuss anti-colonialism and colonies in general and so on, Russia is rarely discussed
Right.
because there's quite a strong bias from people towards the USSR and so on. But these are colonies, and if you ask anyone from Estonia, for example, how it was to be part of Russia, They have quite clear thoughts about it, and Russia did rob all the republics of their all their wealth and all their resources, and send the people who opposed Russia's domination to gulags in eastern Russia, somewhere in Siberia and so on. So it's a colony and an empire that is still going, and that is allowed to go, and at some point, uh, at least us in the West and our scholars need to talk about it more than we currently do. But I don't know about the potential for cutting it to small pieces. One last point is that what I said about stability with Russia, it would create a lot of instability if you would have Chechnya become an independent country, and if you would have maybe some republic that has nukes say that they are independent while keeping the nuclear weapons, for example, that be an issue for the world. So there are opportunities, and in some way, would love to see Russia become 10 different small, weak nations. But at the same time, there are also threats for the world security involved with that. So yeah, I'm not too optimistic, but also not too pessimistic. I'm just watching and seeing how things evolve on that.
Let me ask you one more question. So we
Yeah.
have from the audience member,
Yeah.
a woman named Natalie Joni. She wants to ask, um, has there been any leaked information about NATO members' trust in the USA, given Trump's love for Putin? And then the second is, has there been any further discussion about Ukraine joining NATO? I'm assuming now, right? So
Hmm.
first off, do members of NATO? I remember the president. I believe the president of Portugal called him a objective Soviet asset, uh, or Russian asset. The president of Portugal said that. Now he's not in Five Eyes, but that is pretty amazing that he would say that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Has anyone in NATO, um, other than the president of Portugal and some French senator who compared him to Nero, objectively said, we just can't work with this guy because he's working with the enemy?
So I don't think that these have been leaks, but there have been both polls about the general view of populations inside of NATO countries and their trust towards the U.S. and Trump, and those have shown that people trust the U.S. way less than they did even two
Yeah.
years ago. And then there have been politicians other than the French senator. Many leaders in Europe have said it in a less direct way, but for example, when Macron has been talking about European strategic autonomy and things like these, it's his way of diplomatically saying that we need to rely less on the US and that we cannot trust the US. And that's been quite a common thing to say in Europe during the Trump time. And obviously, when our leaders talk to Trump, they try to be nice and they try to buy time and they try to make sure Trump continues to sell at least some weapons to Ukraine and so on. So there is the official rhetoric that we have when talking with Trump, and then there is the rhetoric internally. And the rhetoric internally is that we trust the U.S. way less than before, unfortunately. And then when it comes to Ukraine, actually, Ukraine's ex-commander in chief Zaluzhny talked about it a couple of days ago, and he said that he doesn't believe that Ukraine will ever join NATO after 12 years of empty promises.
Yeah.
My take is that as long as the war continues, Ukraine is not going to join, because even Finland and Sweden had a hard time joining NATO because there was Hungary and Turkey blocking it. And those were only two countries, but you need everyone to agree. And Ukraine is at war with Russia. So if Ukraine would become a part of NATO during the war, then we would be at
Yeah.
war with Russia. And that's something that's not going to happen. And that's also sadly an incentive for Russia to continue the war, because as long as the war will continue, Ukraine will not be part of NATO. So that's an issue, and that's something that has been discussed a bit. And for example, the Finnish president has said that we could maybe try to create a new form of NATO membership to allow Ukraine to join without having Article 5 directly, so that they would be members without actually being members. But I don't see any others really supporting that claim. And yeah, I mean, once the war ends, it would make total sense for Ukraine to join, because
They have all
Ukraine
the
is a buffer
experience.
state, not in the sense that it should be one, but it's a very powerful country in between, and it's a country that really fights for our security, and they have some military knowledge and experience that we don't have in NATO, and they can really improve our security by joining. So obviously, we would want them to join, and many of our leaders and countries would want them to join, but right now it unfortunately seems quite unlikely. And also, when the war ends, Russia is going to try to make it impossible for them to join. And my guess is that Ukraine would agree to a compromise where they are allowed to join the European Union, but not allowed to join NATO. So in that sense, I hope that one day they will join NATO, but I'm not holding my breath. I think it's not something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Well, listen, Joni, thank you so much for coming on to our sort
Thanks.
of special history of the present. We're looking to start maybe doing more of these daily. If you're not a subscriber to History of the Present, please subscribe. If you're not a paid subscriber, please subscribe. We're going to start doing more events, and we are going to start doing of course, Natalie. And we're going to start doing more things with the community, I think. There's all these opportunities. And obviously, please give Joni Ascola, a follow on Substack and on X and Blue Sky. And I believe you're on some others. Uh, and give him a follow because he really knows what he's talking about when it comes to geostrategy and security. Joni, it's really been a pleasure having you on today. Look forward to having you back on again.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and I'd be happy to be back on. And as you said, I don't have a Substack, but I made one today to be able to join these. So I will start using Substack more, and also maybe start writing there. So thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully I'll be back soon.
Thank you, Joni. Everyone, have a great day.
Thanks.